There is a life and there is a death, and there are beauty and melancholy in between. When I was 11 and my great-grandmother died, I had my first brush with overwhelming, devastating sadness. I was washed away by it, taken adrift in a torrent of longing, helplessness, and hopelessness. It was crushing, suffocating, like the entire world was becoming smaller, closing in on me. This sadness snatched me from the ground and held me aloft, forcing me to see the futility of my situation, the futility of everyone's situation. I didn't try to break from its grasp, though. Instead, I let it take me where it wanted. I sank into this feeling as deep as I could. It was the only thing that made sense. Even then, I remember thinking, to feel anything else, anything other than abject misery, it just wasn't the right thing to feel. Part of me knew I needed to feel this sadness, that it was an important thing to feel. The strength of that particular torment eventually faded. I was able and willing to feel other things again, to find the beauty in life. That idea never left me, though, the importance of feeling sadness, the wading into it like a cold stream, and letting it wash you away. This was the other thing that existed between life and death, after all, the melancholy, the morbid, derelict, decaying, and sorrowful. I was hoping we could explore that idea a little bit further. The goal for most of us is, of course, to find maximum happiness, to experience as much joy as possible with as little pain as possible, to have a life that is full of experiences of love, peace, and bliss. However, this is a tall order. Those moments of sorrow will inevitably come. The beauty of the world is the light of life, of course. The thing about light, though, is that it has to be constant. The moment the light disappears, for even a second, darkness is all there is. Darkness is the natural state of the universe, it would seem. And light has to fight just to carve out small sections of darkness, only for it to return as soon as the light burns out. So though most of us live in search of the light, let's talk about those of us who don't. Let's discuss sadness and when and how it can be appropriate and even useful. Let us take a look at the melancholy and why sometimes it actually feels good to be gloomy. And let's find out if sorrow really is the best muse when it comes to putting beauty into art. Is it possible to fall in love with darkness? I'm Jourdain, and this is See for Yourself. In the opening lines of his 1976 poem, Melancholia, Charles Bukowski writes,
"The history of melancholia includes all of us. Me, I writhe in dirty sheets while staring at blue walls and nothing. I have gotten so used to melancholia that I greet it like an old friend. I will now do 15 minutes of grieving for the lost redhead, I tell the gods. I do it and feel quite bad, quite sad. Then I rise, cleansed, even though nothing is solved."
I think this piece illustrates an important theme. The narrator refers to sadness or melancholia as this inevitable force that finds all of us. He does not fight that feeling any longer, but rather greets it like an old friend. He invites melancholia inside for an amount of time, 15 minutes of allotted grieving, half sarcastically stating that they feel the sadness, the badness, like they are supposed to, but that it cleanses them. Baptism by fire, destroying much, but changing little. While grief, sorrow, or misery may be inevitable, that doesn't mean this cleansing is. Emotions, especially the darker ones, come on in waves, and like a wave, you can either be taken under by it, or you can ride it out. Too often, in our search to understand or even control our emotions, the ultimate solution to sadness is to not feel it at all, to look on the bright side, be optimistic, to find coping strategies or even ways to remove ourselves from the negative whenever possible. We do the same with anger, but that's another subject for another time. While happiness and joy are thought to be sought after at all cost, sadness and misery must be cast completely aside. Perhaps it is because of how easy it is to experience the benefits of positive emotions. After all, they make you feel good. The mental, physical, and emotional pleasure that comes from positive emotions are the emotions themselves. That's what emotions are. And the mental, physical, and emotional pain that comes from negative emotions are those negative emotions. But I don't think we evolved with brains that produce negative emotions as some sort of weight that must be cast aside in the pursuit of the positive ones. We have our entire emotional range because all of those feelings serve us. They have use. Obviously, being completely swept away by misery, loneliness, and despair is absolutely something to be avoided, but we will get into that in a bit. Let's talk about the practical uses of our own sadness for a moment. Firstly, discounting mental illness, there is a biological reason we feel the way we do when we experience something devastating. Our bodies react to things like the loss of a loved one, personal failure, or emotional hardship as if they are losing one of their own limbs. Our brains tend to send signals to cry, to rage, to lie in bed numb, as if it's sending the same signals that it would to heal an injury. When you get a wound on your flesh, the body begins to fuse it back together. In the process, the wound becomes this bloody, scabby, tender, grotesque thing. Eventually, though, the scab comes off, and you're basically good as new. There could be a scar or a mark that may or may not fade over time, but your flesh will be able to function as it should. When you get an emotional wound, your body does the same thing and tries to fuse that wound back together. This may look like a snotty, face-swelling, crying fit. It may look like weeks in bed with no shower. These things are the scabs of emotional wounds, but eventually, with or without a lasting scar, you should be able to emotionally function as normal. In my experience, trying to mask my sadness has been much like picking a scab. It might be oddly satisfying, but I'm only prolonging the healing process and increasing the odds of leaving a scar. When your emotional health is in prime condition, our negative emotions become part of the healing process. This is probably the most practical use they have, but let's go a bit further. See, I think that sadness has a greater value than that of just a healing process. I think it is fundamental to the human condition. I think all emotions are. I think they are the main ways we are able to gain sincere empathy with others. If we allow ourselves to experience and understand all of our own emotions, including the darker ones, we are more likely to understand when and why others are experiencing these emotions. I believe we can understand negative emotions like grief as part of a healing process quite easily, as exemplified in the widely known 5 stages model. In this, we can accept its utility and see it as a rational emotion to have, given the circumstances it is most experienced under. What about irrational sadness, though? Since we know negative emotions can have a biological use, and we can accept their need for emotional connections and empathy, let's talk a bit more about the ones that have no obvious use. The ones you have no business feeling, because after all, your life isn't that bad. I'm sure many of you have some experience with good old classical clinical depression, the most irrational sadness of them all. Chemical imbalance, general unfulfillment, whatever you want to call it, it can strike when everything should be just fine. Yourself or others give you a hard time. Other folks have it way worse. Don't you know how lucky you are? And you do, and you know you shouldn't be sad, but you are. And that makes you feel worse. What could the utility of that possibly be? Feeling despair when you should feel joy. Feeling lost when you should feel comforted. It is, admittedly, most likely just a malfunction of our brains. Brought on by diet perhaps, lack of sunlight, a misfiring of synapses, even passed down genetically from our parents' malfunctioning brains. My depression doesn't always feel like that, though. Oftentimes, it feels like there is definitely a reason my brain is doing what it is. I just can't figure out what the reason is. Maybe you felt that way too. Maybe that's just part of the malfunction. Either way, I've learned to sort of just accept sadness whenever I feel it. I manage to float through my depressive episodes. I can't say that I have a full understanding of my emotions, and I definitely can't say I have full control over them. No one can. If anyone says that, they're lying. You can't magically chi an emotional signal to or from you. Your brain sends the signal, subconsciously or mechanically. It happens without your conscious consent. So no, you can't control which emotions your body gives you. You can only control your experience and reaction to them. Even so, not everyone experiences the same range of emotions, nor are their emotions triggered by the same input from the world around them. All that being said, I don't try to control my emotions anyway. I simply react to them in the best way that I have figured out, up to that point, and that process changes all the time. I sort of realize when my depression is starting to send those signals from my brain. I can acknowledge what is happening and even change my daily behavior to make sure I can experience my emotions without causing any issues in my external life. Sometimes this does actually mean doing something productive. Trying to fill my time in, not necessarily masking my emotions, but at least doing something while I'm having them. Writing, drawing, making music, using the sadness as a fuel. Or even, working on my house or my moped, just doing something I need to do and feeling sad at the same time. It's not fun, it doesn't make me happier, and it doesn't need to. Not everything has to be fun. I can do something I enjoy without feeling joy, and I'm okay with that. Sometimes, though, I might just set some time aside to sit and process that sadness. If I know I'm depressed, sometimes I just give myself rest. I might let myself be lazy or sleep more, eat like shit, be a depressed person. For me, using whichever one of these or other methods that I feel suit the occasion, the sadness usually ends. Regrettably, this methodology took a long time to develop. Before I had the strategies I do now, I dealt with darkness in a less productive way. The death of my great-grandma might have been my first brush with that consuming, suffocating kind of sadness, but it wasn't my first experience with the darkness. Even at a young age, I was experiencing symptoms of what would eventually be the sort of depression that I now have. However, it isn't really the depression that I mean when I say darkness. Not in this case, anyway. As a kid, I was just sort of interested in sadness. in the other side of human emotion. I suppose it may have been the small inklings of the depressive symptoms that sparked that curiosity. Either way, this sort of shaped the way I looked at the world and the information, art, and entertainment I sought out. I think a lot of folks experience this kind of thing, our dark lenses tinting our view, informing our taste and personalities. After all, the desire to investigate the darkness is why entertainment genres like tragedy and horror exist. It is where philosophies like nihilism and absurdism come from, and in part, it is where our empathy and connection to others comes from. The darkness isn't just negative emotions, but an interest in them, and sometimes an attachment to them. A curiosity, a longing, to become intimate, to really know, if only vicariously. So, we dive in, head first. We go stumbling around in the night, seeing what creatures exist just beyond our sight. We find dark music and books and movies and poetry and art. We get into Sylvia Plath or Franz Kafka or directors like David Cronenberg or Werner Herzog. We find ourselves latching on to the different expressions of different pains from others, soaking ourselves in it, trying to find understanding, searching from one end of the emotional spectrum to the other, begging to know the darkness. And for some, this is enough. We get our fill of the dreary and depressing from our entertainment and our art. We feel connection, contentment. The rest of our time can be spent on life's true aim, the pursuit of happiness. Unfortunately, this doesn't placate everyone. Others search deeper still into the deep, abysmal plane, unable to live without experiencing the lack of light for themselves. A few minutes ago, when I said I didn't always have the understanding of my emotions that I now do, I now believe that part of this issue was caused by my own desire to know darkness intimately, at least subconsciously. See, if you watched any of my other videos, you probably know where my desire to investigate these things led me, namely to addiction. On the surface, a lot of my behavior at that time revolved around suppressing my emotions. I thought that I needed to numb the sadness, to drown out the depression. Really though, I was capable of feeling happy. I felt happy at least as much of the time as I felt sad. The thing was, I could understand the happiness. And though I could understand some of the sadness, there was a significant portion which I could not. Subsequently, after some reflection, I believe my foray into hazardous chemicals and substances was partly based on a desire to understand the negative emotions I was feeling, not cover them up. Because I knew the needle definitely wasn't the much needed light coming to cast out the darkness. It was a shovel I would use to dig deeper into the void. I don't think I knew at the time how much I reveled in it, wallowed in it really, relishing the nights I could spend alone in the dark in my pay-by-the-week one-room efficiency apartment, craving the moment I could draw the curtains, mix up my concoction, and sink into the nothingness, the lack of light, the lack of life. Even when I lost the apartment and the job, and the one room was replaced by somebody's couch on a good night, or a car on a normal night, or a tent on a bad night, when I saw the look people gave me, knowing what they thought, there he is, broken, defeated, addicted, knowing they were right, and loving it. I guess I can say, no, I don't think I consciously knew how much I loved it. Physically, the situation was miserable. I wanted a way out. I wanted happiness. I wanted light. But, though I didn't know it, in my pursuit of darkness, I hadn't only found it, I had become part of it. I had the understanding I was so desperate for, and I wish that I didn't. I do have a more satisfying ending to that whole ramble, but I want to pull up on the reins here for a second. To clarify, I definitely didn't know at the time I was trying to understand the perceived negative side of the human condition. I thought, at first, that I was just having fun. When I got honest with myself, I realized I was trying to cover up pain. It wasn't until I began to value honesty and truth as principles that I was able to analyze my actions to this further extent. Like myself, I don't think most people realize what it is they're searching for when they find themselves drifting toward the melancholic. We think we are actually masking despair, or even giving ourselves a natural immunity to it. Sometimes we believe we are becoming hardened, cold, calculated. Even those who are in outright chase of happiness often don't really know what it is they are looking for, or if and why they want to understand it. It's just what we end up doing. Now, that's not to say we don't usually have a surface level understanding of our motivations, nor that we haven't done a touch of subterranean exploring, so to speak. Plenty of people, with or without much introspection, can clearly define the motives of their actions. Usually, though, the end desire is to feel something positive. We build careers, families, communities, so that we feel secure, loved, safe, and valued. And we want those experiences because those emotions feel physically, mentally, and emotionally good. This is easy to understand. Digging a little deeper, we can also understand why these experiences are so vital to the condition of being human. With these sorts of emotions, we can see where they fit into place, the parts of us that they inhabit, the roles that they fill. Because those other emotions are not as well illuminated, their roles are harder to make out. What makes some of us cut against the grain in pursuit of sadness? Literally and metaphorically, darkness is the natural stasis of the universe. Every star, no matter how massive, is merely carving out a temporary reprieve from the darkness. At the beginning and at the end, there can be nothing else. Cold, isolated emptiness, stretching on beyond the bounds of the human imagination. A splendorous, deafening silence. All matter, all movement, light, and life is there to push this darkness backward, to keep it abated for as long as possible. Every galaxy, any possible empire, crying out in agony against its inevitable fate. Humankind are very much like the stars in this way. Everything we do is in rebellion against the natural state of things. When we first evolved into conscious beings and took that first breath in reflection, we knew. We saw that this world was built on sadness, on darkness. All things, humans included, would eventually die. There would be no answers from above or below, only what we could come up with in our heads. So for the most part, we revolted. All animals reproduce, but we deliberately began forming families and communities. All animals nest or rest in some fashion, but we built lifelong homes, towns, roads. With death and darkness close behind, we kept building. We kept the light on. And though much of human history is filled with destruction and hatred and guilt and grief and the flavors of darkness, we kept a fire going. Now, I'm not saying life is inherently pointless, or that there is definitely no afterlife, or there is one, or anything like that, really. I'm just making an analogy. Just as actual darkness is the natural state of the universe, emotional darkness is kind of the natural state of our world. However many thousands of years into civilization, into this fire, casting out the imminent darkness, and people still suffer. We are born into a world of wars, famines, disasters, mass murders, poverty, etc. We are then told to cast out the natural feelings about these things so that we can achieve the optimal goal of happiness. Through this, I believe we are called to darkness, not just because it is a part of us, but because it is our natural state. It is our home, and it wants us to come back. So anyway, the worst place I found myself sleeping during my addiction was on a 2-inch thick cloth mat on a cold concrete floor in my local county jail. My wanderings through the dark had led me to one of the darkest places of them all, felony district court in a Commonwealth state. There were a lot of depressing aspects of my stay, which I think goes without saying, but I'm going to mosey on past most of them. As you would know if you watched my previous video, I do intend on making a longer video about my experience in jails and prisons. Maybe soon, maybe in a year. Don't really have a set schedule I can commit to because of my job, but it'll happen. Moving on. There was one particular experience I had during a stay in 2015 that always stuck with me. Funnily enough, or not funny at all really, at least 25 of the 30 or so guys in my pod were also there from substance-related offenses. That's actually a running theme I'll probably touch on in that future video. As a consequence of this, a lot of the in-house discussions, if you will, revolved around said substances. Glory days stories, near-death experiences, desires to use more, desires to quit, promises, prayers. I remember sitting in one cell, drinking coffee, playing spades with 3 other guys. 3 of the 4 of us were having an enthusiastic conversation about quitting. This jail shit was starting to open our eyes. We had lives to live. The 4th guy, though, a fella I used to cop from, he wasn't so sure. His card partner asked him, "Don't you want more for yourself?" "Not really," he said. "You want to keep ending up in this place?" his partner asked further. "No, but that's why I'll try harder not to get caught. But if I can get high for 2 years and spend 1 in jail, that's a win for me," was his response. My partner and I were quiet, just looking at each other. "What about your family, your kid?" his partner asked further. His son, coincidentally, was in the pod across the hall, also in for related charges. "What about him? He's grown," the guy responded. I am mostly paraphrasing, and this conversation went on for a bit. However, the way it ended was the part I remember most clearly. After some pressing, the guy finally said something to the effect of, "Look, man, I know who I am. I found what I want. I don't care what it costs me. I will never quit. I'm in love with the darkness." I got out about a month later, 3 days after this guy's son got out. 3 days after that, the son was gone. OD'd in a car with some friends, pushed out alone on the side of the road. The dad eventually got out. He still uses, consumed by the darkness now. In love with something that can and will never love him back. That experience scared the shit out of me, because when we sat in that cold, dank, empty cell and I heard him say those words for the first time, "in love with the darkness," I knew exactly what he meant. I felt it reverberate off my bones, rattle around inside me, and come bursting out of my skull in all directions. I knew we shared the same mistress, and I knew she was a killer. Now, at this point, I knew I had to end this relationship I found myself in. Of course, back then, I only related this concept to my addiction and the place I had arrived at because of it. I didn't yet understand that addiction was just the one route I took toward the abyss, a symptom of a larger problem. My infatuation with darkness wasn't love at first sight either. We got to know each other over time. She found my weaknesses, my desires, pulling me in, weaving a delicate trap, whispering sweet, simple promises in my ear. The chemicals, they were just an aphrodisiac, a pheromone, meant to loosen me up along my trip into the void. I'm sure some of you can relate to this, but I've been thinking about death since I learned it existed. Sometimes from a place of fear, sometimes a place of curiosity. Here and there, from a place of desire. Wondering what it feels like, supposing, at the least, it must be a sort of freedom and untethering. I think about that moment, however many years after my own death, that my name will be spoken for the last time. The moment the last person who knows of me leaves this earth as well. The footsteps I've left that will be inevitably washed away in the passage of time. I imagine what non-existence would be like, and if it's even possible. I wonder if it's better or worse than what the world's religions have come up with. If there is something after, will I even be myself there? I wonder what the self is, and if it even matters. Rarely do I ever actually want to die. Sure, there have been occasions, but most of the time I think I'm just genuinely interested. I think about those emotions associated with death, grief, despair, mourning, the relationship they have with the loss of a person, the loss of a self. I can usually only conclude that death isn't just a natural part or a natural end to life. Death is equal to life. Non-existence must be equal to existence. And that brings my mind to nothingness, how it must be equal to all the matter, all the energy, all the life. I find a little peace there, if only temporarily. So why does the light have to fight so hard just to carve out a small piece of the darkness? Are they not equal as well? Or is the darkness really stronger than the light? Nothing stronger than something. Death stronger than life. After all of life is a struggle to stave off death for as long as possible, just like the light struggles against the dark. And how could I not be drawn to such a force? How could I not fall in love with such beauty, grace, and power? Before we get to the conclusion, I want to give a brief, practical example of two conflicting types of darkness and the ways they appeal to all of us, whether we realize it or not. To do this, I want to discuss two of the most contentious horror films of the last decade, made by the same director, no less. I am, of course, referring to Hereditary and Midsummer, respectively, both directed by Ari Aster. Spoiler alert, by the way, while I'm not going to go into any intense detail, I will be assuming you've seen the movies for this next part. Otherwise, go on and skip ahead. In Hereditary, we see a family dealing with tragedy. First the grandmother, then the daughter die in the first half of the movie. Throughout all of this, the family seems to be plagued by the presence of some sort of demonic force. The tone and overall visual style of this movie is very dark. There are demonic sigils hidden everywhere, and the scoring is meticulously designed to force shivers down your spine. At the center of the actual horror, however, is the brutal depiction of the emotions felt by the family. The thousand-yard stare and catatonic behavior of the son when he realized he's accidentally killed his sister. The desperate wailing of the mother when she finds the body. The conversation between the two, filled with spite and bitterness. The darkness in this movie, to me, isn't felt in the demonic forces, but in the strained family relationship and subsequent emotions of the victims. Midsummer also deals with a family tragedy in the very first scene. This time, our protagonist's entire family dies, all at once and under horrifying circumstances. This movie, however, is vastly different in its tone, visual style, and score. Midsummer is brightly lit, saturated with beautiful color and sound, and looks on the surface to be a much lighter movie. Of course, we know this isn't the case. Our hero is reluctantly dragged to a remote village in Europe by a boyfriend that the audience knows wants to break up with her. Here again, we see the horror in the emotions, the relationships. In the opening scene, we see Florence Pugh cry for like a straight minute or so over the death of her family. And this scene, to me, was one of the most horrifying I've ever seen. The feigned relationship from the boyfriend, the distance, the loneliness, it eats through you much more effectively than the cliff-diving, skull-hammering elders. Both of these films do a brilliant job of conveying the darkness of emotion, the horror of our most common relationships. Let's talk about some of the interesting differences, though. In Hereditary, they are haunted by an obviously supernatural dark force. In the film, though, the main characters don't really seem to believe in the supernatural. Now sure, the boy does start experiencing demonic possession symptoms, and the mom does try to talk to her dead daughter with the help of a witch. But it is implied that not only does the dad think they're both crazy, they also kind of think they're going crazy themselves. There is a real darkness to their interactions with each other, but the characters in the audience are sort of left to believe, up until the end, that there is no actual dark entity causing this. Of course, that turns out not to be the case. There really is a demon whose arrival was planned for decades. There is an outside dark force causing all the pain in this movie. In Midsommar, though, there is no supernatural entity. There's just a bunch of weird hippies taking mushrooms and tricking and tripping themselves into believing something spiritual is happening. The actions of the cult are supposed to be driven by love, respect, and reverence. But we learn pretty quickly that they're brutally murdering people based on some freak religion that somebody made up and drew all over the walls. In this movie, the darkness is inside of the people. Their pain is causing the outward appearance of the supernatural. In one, you have an outside dark force causing human suffering. In the other, you have darkness coming directly from inside the humans themselves, causing the suffering of others. In the first, they believe the darkness is in them when it's actually out. In the second, they believe the darkness is outside of them when it is within. These two depictions, when viewed together, kind of show the broad spectrum of nothingness a little bit. We either pretend it's not there, or we force others to see that it is. It is a magnetic force bringing us to it through any channel it can find. And eventually, the pull becomes so strong that even light cannot escape. A dense, heavy darkness snuffing out everything. And it's perfect. It's equal. In those moments of intense pain, suffering, loss, and chaos, the darkness seems to serve as a reminder of the futility of light. It bellows in our ears that through our best efforts, our strongest wills, we will still exist but for a moment. And that moment will be meaningless among the countless others as the whole of existence marches ceaselessly into inevitable decay. Thankfully, though, I don't really believe in any of that. When I walk in a room, I turn the light on. I don't care that that switch will get turned back off, or that the bulb will eventually burn out, or that one day the room won't exist anymore. No, I just want to be able to see. Ultimately, I don't think that darkness is more powerful than light, literally or metaphorically, and even if it is, I don't care. I still want to turn on the light. I'm always going to want to see. If my entire life, everything I've ever done, equates to nothing more than a light bulb, built to expire, I still want to live it well. I still strive for moments of joy. I still want to see others succeed and feel happiness for themselves. If anything, I want it more. My intimacy with the negative has given me an appreciation for it, but it's also given me a greater appreciation for the positive. Because I've learned to comfortably walk around in the dark, I am that much more grateful when I don't have to. Whether you have an interest in it, a fear of it, an attraction to it, or a hatred of it, darkness exists. It is both outside of us and within us. It was here before us and will be all there is after everything else is gone. Wickedness, bitter resentment, abandonment, disease, warfare, these things manifest themselves in the places we refuse to look, in those shaded corners of the world, the places we avoid when walking alone. But that's not all there is, and it certainly does not have to be in control of your life. So yes, make friends with the darkness, make love to it, fall asleep next to it. Just make sure you leave yourself a path home, and not to venture too far outside the light. I don't really know what the point of this video was. I just wanted to try and analyze what it is that calls certain people toward a certain path. Why some people choose to walk just outside the glow of the street lamp. If it did anything for you, let me know. If you've been exploring the darkness, out or inside of you, maybe it made sense. If not, maybe it's something you want to give a try. Just remember, when you're done, turn the light back on so you can see for yourself.